No way. It worked.
Hello. Hello from Austria.
Very nice. You know, it's the old saying: turn it on, turn it turn it off, turn it back on. And
pull the plug, yeah.
IT 101. IT 101. So cool.
Yep. Good to see you, Kevin. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, good to see you too. I'm excited. I'm excited to hear your presentation myself and get this going. So always a pleasure. Can you just double check and make sure the option to share your screen is still available there, and let's get that going so you can pull your slide up. Your presentation.
Seems like a good idea. Yeah, let's definitely do that. All right, share screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
You should be able to.
Just clicking it again, and I get the same message.
So you can now do video, but you can't do screen share. That's
yeah.
Interesting. If I make you the host, I think that will kick me out though. Otherwise, change role to attendee. See here, that is really interesting. Oh, I got you. There we go. That's right.
Here we go.
Look at that. Just in time.
What do you think?
I like it. Very good. I appreciate it, David.
Hey, no problem.
Right on time too. Look at us.
Yeah, not bad.
It looks like people are starting to join. We are recording the session, David, so you know we can share the video with you afterwards, and we'll publish it and all that kind of stuff. So it'll be great.
Yeah.
For those that are just joining, I see a number of people popping on, so we'll get started here in just about a minute as we let people pop on. It takes a second to work through some of the audio Q&A and all that kind of fun stuff. We are going to have a 3 Q&A. 3 Q&A, that's what we're going to call it, a 3 Q&A after David's done. So you should have the ability to throw a question up in the Q&A option. And the way we set up this video is, no Zoom bombing allowed. So we kind of have it on lockdown. That's why we were going through some technical difficulties to make sure we had David have the right access he needed. So Q&A will be submitted. Videos won't be up except for David and myself. I'll turn mine off once we get going, and then we'll do Q&A afterwards. So we got a nice showing of people. Let's go. Let's go ahead and get this going. I want to start off by introducing my good friend and someone I have a lot of respect for, David Portney. He's been in the industry for, gosh, how many years now?
10 years now.
10 years. That's crazy.
It is.
Let me do this really quick. I actually owe a huge debt to David. I think we met maybe 7, 8 years ago, something like that. And I was talking with David, and I was telling him the person, someone I was looking to hire, and he actually referred me to Jason Wright, who now is the COO of our company and runs our company. So I still owe David a huge stake, and we got to be able to hopefully go out there and do that soon. So David actually just started as a hobby, like many people do in SEO, right? They started out in like 2008. And then in January of 2010, he started his professional work at a small agency, actually in Vancouver. And then he started moving more into an enterprise level, where he did work with Portney, headquartered in Seattle, about 2 years later. And then after working with Portney for 3 years, David now works as the senior SEO manager for 3Q Digital, which is based in Silicon Valley. And I like David. He has a tagline. He's like, yes, I'm very into SEO, but let's call it a passion, not an obsession. Okay. So I love to geek out with David. He is has a very good understanding of technical SEO, but also in a way to communicate it effectively so everyone understands it, all the stakeholders understand it, from developers to other people in the team. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, David, and let you get started, and I'll turn off my video, so not distracting.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate the warm welcome and the intro. It's definitely a pleasure to have known you all this time, and to know that Jason Wright is helping you out over there. Jason's a great guy. And really grateful to be here with all of you right now and do this presentation today. So let's get moving. And you know, here's my postcard to you all. I wish you were here. I wish we were all together. When this meeting was originally scheduled, of course, you know, Digital Marketing Quarterly, or DMQ for short, is always held at Web4 headquarters in downtown Vancouver. Really nice headquarters, really nice downtown area. And it's always great to be down there and, you know, meet you all face to face. So I'm sorry we're not face to face. I wish we could be, but I'm looking forward to the time when we can all get together again. A little bit of repeat, quick bio. I did start it kind of on my digital marketing journey in 1999. I took a local class online with the community college where I used to live in Southern California. I took an HTML class and started making websites just, you know, to goof off, just for fun. This whole internet thing was really still kind of new. Back then it was the information superhighway. Anybody remember the information superhighway? And before it was the internet. And so I was kind of fascinated by that, and this whole website thing was just kind of a goof, just kind of fun, just, you know, messing around with this whole new internet thing. Nobody knew. Some of the veterans here will remember, nobody knew if this internet thing was just a fad or, right? You kind of have to laugh, right? Was the internet a fad? We actually wondered that. So then, as Kevin mentioned, in 2008, I took up SEO as a hobby. Back in 1999, I had zero interest in being a marketer, quite frankly. You know, marketing was something that I thought was just something that tries to interrupt my experience while I'm trying to either watch TV or otherwise do anything. You know, those evil marketers, right, trying to get me to buy their stuff, you know. Ugh, who wants to know anything about marketing? But in between 1999 and 2008, I'd written some books and I'd created some audio books, so I had some products, and I thought, hey, what if I were to marry my skill of being able to create a website with these products? And I've heard about this stuff called SEO, you know, and I've heard that if you, like, it's some kind of voodoo, right, or some kind of set of magic tricks, and you can just, you know, fool Google or whatever, and you can rank #1 for anything you want to rank. And I thought, wow, if I learn that magic fairy dust, I'll be getting rich, you know. I want to get on this internet gold rush thing, you know, because I'm a little late to the party. Everybody's getting rich online but me. But as I was doing it for a couple of years, I found myself a bit obsessed and fascinated. I had a full-time job, but on evenings and weekends, I was like doing SEO and studying SEO and taking SEO classes and trying to figure out how this stuff worked and trying to apply it and figure it all out, because it really wasn't clear. If you've ever tried to study SEO, you might have had a similar experience. So in 2010, I had the opportunity to parlay my experience into an actual position at a company after I relocated here to Vancouver, Washington. And I relocated here on November 1st, 2009. And within 72 days, I was starting my first position, which I was really thrilled about. Later, as Kevin indicated, I had a desire to move to a more enterprise level of SEO work, because at the small local agency I originally started with, we were working essentially with small business owners, you know, your doctors, lawyers, dentists, real estate agents, that kind of thing. And certainly nothing wrong with that kind of work. It's a bit of a different animal, local SEO, than enterprise level. And I quite frankly like working on the enterprise level a little bit more. It's just kind of where I feel a better affinity for things, for larger websites and bigger companies. It's just kind of my thing. Other people prefer to work with small businesses, and that's their thing. So everybody has their thing. And so going to work for Ian Lurie at Portney was actually kind of a dream come true. Ian Lurie is a legend in the industry, and I really admired him. You know, like I mentioned in my SEO journey, from hobby to professional, it was still hard to figure out, like, what's true and what's not true in SEO, and what really works and what doesn't work, and who's full of baloney and who's telling the truth out there. And Ian was always a guy you could really trust and know that you're getting the real deal from. By the way, Kevin's the same way. If Kevin says something, you can pretty much guarantee he knows what he's talking about. So I always looked up to Ian. I was really happy to go to work for him. And then 3 years later, an offer was made for me to work at 3Q Digital, where I still am today. I'm really thrilled there. We've got a big team of about 20 SEOs, And it's just a fantastic place to be. We've got offices all over the country, and that's it's just a wonderful thing. I'm really happy there. And so I've got a minor disclaimer. So like all SEO, 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 well, but this presentation is not about SEO. So what's up with that, right? You know, because frankly, I could talk about SEO all day. But we're actually going to talk about web technology. So why are we talking about web technology? So my disclaimer here is, you know, damn it, Jim, I'm an SEO, not a programmer, coder, or developer. So the fact of the matter is that I think that you need to know something about web technology in order to be able to do your job better. But really quick, so still on SEO, this is my SEO before picture. I kind of hinted at this, right? Wanted to get rich online. I'm like, well, when I learn that SEO magic, I'll just be counting cash and smoking cigars, right? And this is me after, you know, like I said, a little late to the gold rush. I started doing SEO, and you know, after a few years, I was like, wow, this, you know, it's like there ain't really any shortcuts, you know. I mean, there used to be, right, before 2010, before 2008. You know, like I said, I was a little late to the SEO party, but most of the, you know, shortcuts between and, you know, sort of tricks that you could get away with between 2010 and 2012 pretty much got closed. You know, there might still be some today, but that's not the point. The point is that, you know, I went from what I thought SEO was all about to then what it really was about. And so here's the agenda of stuff we're going to talk about. And again, none of this is SEO. So why are we going to talk about all this stuff? As we think about, I don't need to read this to you, you can see the list, but we're going to talk about everything from, you know, what really is the internet to how the internet works, web hosting, servers, server logs, domain names, URLs, you know, all these acronyms, right? HTML, JSON-LD, all this stuff. Front end versus back end, programming languages and scripting languages, content management systems, content delivery networks, security online, APIs, and finally some more acronyms, right? AMP, PWA, and SPA. So it's a lot of stuff, and none of it's SEO. So why would we talk about any of that? Well, frankly, because it's my opinion, and it's also been really my experience, that it's mandatory that you know something about how this thing, the internet, works. You know, these days, even some of the junior SEOs who come on board with our team, you know, they've never actually built a website themselves. And they don't really, you know what the fundamentals are of the internet. And maybe, you know, they've never even coded a website from scratch. Maybe they have some familiarity with HTML, which we'll talk about. But it's the fundamentals. Understanding the fundamentals really helps you to be better at your job. And when I say get stuff done, I mean because you'll be able to, you know, understand what people are talking about, at least have a passing idea, overall familiarity with web technology, so you're not completely lost when you're dealing with different people. Because in your role as a digital marketer, certainly in my role as an SEO, I interface with a lot of people, designers, developers, writers, the C-suite, right? You interface with a lot of people. If you're in digital marketing, that's going to be true of you too. If you're a designer, developer, coder, program manager of any type, you are going to be dealing with a lot of different areas of specialty. So it's good to have a good grasp of the fundamentals of what comprises the internet, what is the technology involved. And you know, it's easy to say, hey, well, yeah, it's not my job or it's not my area of expertise. I'll let the coders, programmers, developers handle that. And that's true. You don't have to know or do everything, right? You don't have to, so for example, you don't have to know how a house is wired for electrical in order to be able to turn on the light switch. But you generally understand the idea that there's wires running through the walls and they're running to the light switch so you can turn them on and the fixture up above you comes on or the lamp comes on or whatever. So the benefits there that I have found, and I think you will too, and you may have already, is that it allows you to, at the bottom here, the bullet points, to be able to speak people's language and thereby, you know, gain some rapport and trust from people. You know, imagine, and when I say gain rapport and trust and speak their language, think about it. If you don't speak Japanese and you go to Japan and you insist that everybody else speak your language, well, you might get lucky and everybody can speak your language, but it's a little arrogant and rude, don't you think, to not at least go somewhere and maybe even try to learn a little bit of the language, especially if you go live there, right? So if you're living in digital marketing like I am, and I think you are too, then you should learn to speak the language. You should at least understand, you know, some basics of the language. And by being able to do that, rather than, you know, claiming ignorance, or that's not my job, or let the developers handle it, or let the designers or whoever handle it, then you gain rapport and trust, and you can help move things forward, because then people see you're just not some schmo who doesn't know what you're talking about, or get laughed out of the room, even worse, right? You can really help to gain rapport and help get projects move forward that way, in whatever your role is. So this presentation, which again is not about SEO, here's my recommendations for how you can get the most out of it. As you saw, we're going to do an overview of a lot of stuff. So what I recommend is take note of any topics that really particularly pique your interest, or you think you should know more about in your role, or you'd just like to know more about, and then just research those topics in more depth later. All the topics that you saw in the beginning at the agenda, I've researched in some depth. And you know how it is. Sometimes you'll research something and have a pretty clear understanding, or even a extremely clear understanding, and then later maybe your understanding fades a little bit. So you might need to go back and review stuff. That happens to me all the time. Sometimes I'm like, oh, Ajax, like, how does that work again? So it's just because you learn it once doesn't mean you have it in your head forever. But again, as long as you have a passing understanding, well, you've got Google as your second brain, of course. Google's our second brain. We can simply go there and research anything quickly and find all the information we need. So here's my outcome for today's presentation. First of all, help you have a broader, overall, help you have a broader understanding of web tech, so that you're more capable and confident in your role, whatever your role is, and whatever your role is in the future. That you more easily gain rapport and trust with various stakeholders, as I mentioned, and that you're more effective in your current digital marketing role, and finally, you actually accomplish more in your career overall. Because there's no telling how far you might go with a broader understanding of things. And who knows? Maybe today we can make a new friend even though we're virtual, huh? All right, so with all that, let's get rolling. Let's dive right in. First thing we'll talk about is the internet versus the World Wide Web. Now again, the context and the focus here is, again, not SEO. It's about web tech. And so what is this internet thing, and really what is this World Wide Web? If you've maybe never stopped to think about it, or had a passing question in your mind about, well, where is the internet? What is it anyway? So let's talk about that a little bit. So the internet, the term internet comes from the term internetworking. And the idea of internetworking, networks of computers together. So if you see this graphic at the top left, you can see we've got 3 different computers here, and each one of them have some, or servers, if you will, and we have all these like laptops hooked up to them. So we've got a network, right? The middle one, we've got some computers hooked up. That's a network, and we've got a network over here. Well, we connect all those together, and now we're internetworking. Excuse me. So the internet itself then is a bunch of internetworked computers all networked together. Now, the World Wide Web technically is a different thing and was, quote unquote, built on top of the internet, if you will. It's a way of accessing information over the internet, and it's what led to the explosion of the information superhighway into what it's become over time, and a really essential part of business, an essential part of our lives. I think it's it's no understatement to say that the internet has really changed our lives dramatically. And by the way, if you don't like it, you can blame Tim. We'll talk about Tim next. And typically when people refer to things, they'll talk about the web or the internet. They typically mean the same thing, but technically they're 2 different things. So there's that. So hopefully that's something that is helpful to you right off the bat, where maybe you had no idea that that was true. So yep, there he is, Tim Berners-Lee. He's the guy who gets the blame for the fact that we all have no attention span left and that Facebook is ruining our lives. No, kidding there. But Tim Berners-Lee implemented like the first successful communication using basically, his statement up here. He said, well, I just had to take hypertext idea and connect it to the TCP idea, transmission control protocol of the internet, and the domain name system idea, and ta-da, the World Wide Web. And he mentioned, as you can see below, that it really was an act of desperation to do that. He was working at CERN, and he couldn't figure out a way to make everything work and try to communicate smoothly, and so he created that communication methodology. So, they say that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, it turns out desperation can be the mother of invention too. So the next time you feel desperate, right, most people don't like feeling desperate. It's a bad situation to be in. I feel, right, I feel like I have no choices. I'm desperate, or I don't know what to do. Maybe that's a good thing, because maybe you'll invent the next internet out of your desperation. So I think a good question is, where the hell is the internet? That's what I wanted to know back in '99. I started doing websites. I'm like, well, where are these files? Where are they going? Where does it exist? So that brings us to the topic of web servers, web hosting, and FTP. So let's get into it. So we're kind of starting to narrow the focus a little bit, right, on web technology. So we understand the internet and the World Wide Web a little better. Now let's get into some of the other technological mechanics of how it all works. So here's the internet. Ta-da! It's basically banks of servers, or sometimes called server farms. And they're very large buildings with lots of different, computers in them, essentially. They're essentially similar to the idea of the computer you may have under your desk or on your desk right now, but you can see that they're rack-mounted computers called servers, and oftentimes they have they'll have whole rooms full of them, so they have built-in redundancy and fail-safe systems, so that if one server goes down, another one picks it up. And it just takes a lot of servers to be able to handle all the information that's flowing around. So welcome to the matrix, the internet. And so these things this is not a real map of where server rooms or server farms are located around the world. But, for example, Google has a bunch of server farms, and they're located all over the world. So you get the idea that servers and hosting companies that have servers are located in various places around the planet. So back when I was creating my first website in 1999, how did I get my website onto the internet? Well, to do it, I had to hire a web hosting service, and they're happy to rent me server space on a monthly basis, or you can pay ahead and pay for a year or 3 years, whatever. But you get the idea. You're renting your space on the internet. And so web hosting companies have servers that can host your web files. They'll typically have a bunch of other offerings too. But generally speaking, the idea of web hosting, the main thrust here, is that web hosting companies have servers, or have access to servers at least, and so for a fee, they will host your files that comprise your website or your websites. So then the question is, well, how do we get our files onto those servers? How do we get them up onto the internet? That's certainly something that I was very curious about way back in the day. And the answer is FTP, File Transfer Protocol. On the left is you with your computer and your files. You created your website, and you use an FTP client or tool, software, to get them onto your hosting services servers. And when you use FTP, it looks something like this. If you've never seen FTP before, I think you'll agree that this is not a particularly intimidating interface if you've ever used Windows Explorer file tree, right? It's just a file tree. Essentially, on the left side are the files that are on your local machine. On the right side are the files that are on your hosting server. And there's a specific place you're going to be uploading your files to, and now they're on the internet when you upload them. Boom! FTP, File Transfer Protocol. You're now connected to the internet and getting your files on there. Once you've uploaded your files, where are they? Here's a convenient map to help you find them. Very easy to find. Just use this map. No problem. No, just kidding. You actually just, all your files are located in a structure in folders. Which brings us to the next topic. Let's talk about server log files. So every time you go to a website and that web page loads, your browser is fetching files from the server and loading them in your browser. And so the HTML it needs, and the JavaScript, and the images, all of those things that comprise a web page are being pulled from the server and displayed in your browser. And so servers have logs of all the requests that are made. And server log files, if you can get your hands on them, look something like this typically. Now I realize this looks like a confusing mass of stuff, but if you break it down, it's really not that hard to understand. Because, server log files provide a lot of useful information if you are wanting to find out what the reality is of what's happening on your website. because it's different than like an analytics program. A lot of people use Google Analytics. Some people use Adobe Analytics. There's other analytics programs as well. But analytics programs are different than server log files. The server log files are actually the reality of what's happening. If you do, maybe someday, maybe we'll be all together looking at a different presentation someday that I give or someone else gives about analytics. But this is not about analytics. But analytics is analytics tracks user behavior essentially by firing JavaScript that exists in the HTML, whereas server log files don't do that. So analytics can fail easily if the code doesn't fire, or if the code is misconfigured, or if there's pages missing code, your analytics can go screwy on you, or your data can at least. So analytics and server log files are not the same thing. The log files are the reality of what's happening with your website, every request that's made. So again, I mentioned that they look kind of confusing, but if we break them down and demystify it, it ain't really rocket surgery. So one thing that you saw on the previous screen is the IP address. That's on the very far left here. And so server logs will log the IP address of whatever machine is making the request. They'll also have a date and time stamp of when that request was made. Then there's the type of request, which is usually either GET or POST, and usually GET, and what request was made. In this case, there was a page that was made in the secret stuff folder, the secrets list page.html, and the protocol. It could be HTTP 1.1 or 2.0, whatever the protocol was. So it's what the request was. Then there's the result of the request. So 200, it's an HTTP status code. So 200 means found, 404 means not found error, page doesn't exist or doesn't exist anymore. 301 means permanently redirected, and there's other HTTP statuses as well. Those are some of the common ones. It will also log the bytes transferred, so essentially the file size. And then if there's a referrer, if someone was on, let's say, stanford.edu and go over to your site, then log files are also recording the referrer as well. And then there's the quote-unquote user agent. So if Google was crawling your site, you can see that. I think this is probably an older user agent string, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. We can always look up, right, Google. We can always look up current user strings, so that's not a big deal. Point is that it will record like what request was made, what was the user agent that made the request. Was it Bing? Was it Google? What was the user agent? So that's kind of server log files demystified. Not necessarily rocket surgery once you break it down, but actually getting log files can be difficult. Getting the information you really want, like log files that are configured to include referrer, they have to be configured. Usually hosts just have standard configurations, but IT departments typically will configure log files to either include or exclude certain bits of information. Server log files you may not be able to get if you work with a publicly traded company, which is certainly the case often with me. With my clients, they're pretty big clients, they're publicly traded, and they're not going to give me access to their log files. That's considered, really super proprietary information. So getting them, you might not be able to get them, but if you can, it's great information, and this is some of the stuff that can help you. So the main benefits of log file analysis, in case you wanted to get your hands on them, are looking for refer traffic that are hitting error pages. People are clicking through from other websites to your website and hitting an error page. That's not the optimal experience. So you'd want to fix that. You'd also want to review how spiders like Google and Bing crawl your site. Where do they go? How often do they crawl certain pages? How deep do they crawl into your website? Are there key pages on your website that should be crawled that aren't getting crawled or not getting crawled very often? You need to know that. You can also, I just mentioned accessibility issues, pages that are not being crawled, you want to be crawled. Good. So now continuing on with understanding web tech, let's kind of talk about domain names and root domains and subdomains a little bit, so that way we can understand that. Because oftentimes people, just like when I said the internet or the web, people might really mean the web technically, but they use the term the internet. So that's okay, and people will sometimes use the term domain name or URL to mean the same thing, but they don't really mean the same thing, and that's okay. That's okay. As long as we understand, we can kind of better understand what people are talking about, even if they use the incorrect term. So we can kind of like demystify things a little bit here and try to understand things a little better. So let's get into that. So what's in a name? What's a domain name? So a domain name, like if you go to web4.com, then web4 is the domain name. And the www here, which stands for World Wide Web. That'd be interesting if one person on the call didn't know that and learn that. That's my mission is complete. Presentation over. Just kidding. Then the .com is called a top-level domain. So really the domain name is that thing right there. Like I said, web4.com or example.com or davidportney.com, whatever. That's your domain name. Web4, that's your domain name. And it's also oftentimes referred to as a root domain. So domain name, root domain really kind of mean the same thing, but oftentimes root domain typically includes the top-level domain.com. So, you know, if you research this stuff online, you'll see different opinions and different angles or different ways of talking about things. Sometimes it can get a little confusing, but that's okay. That's not important. The important point isn't whether experts disagree or have different opinions about how things should be labeled or called. The point is, as long as we have a really good grasp of what this stuff is and what it really is and how it works and what it means, then that helps us to not only be more confident in our own abilities, like I said earlier, but also then to kind of better understand what people are talking about or think they're talking about when they're talking to you about their URL or domain or whatever. So technically, www is a subdomain. If you just have https://mydomain.com, then there's no subdomain in between. And you don't have to have www as a subdomain. It's not required or necessary. It's a standard convention that was used very early on and just kind of continued over time, but it's not actually necessary. So breaking things down a little further and talking about subdomains. So if you want to get really super technical, right, the HTTP part is the protocol, and you're usually going to see https://. Then the subdomain here, sub.example.com, that would be the subdomain. This would be your second level domain technically, and there's your top level domain. So subdomains, you'll typically run into examples where you'll only have one subdomain like this, where you'll have like news.web. Let's say that Web4 decides to put all their news broadcasting pages on like a subdomain called news.web4.com. So you might have that. Or blog.web4.com. And you know, for SEO purposes, maybe it's better to put that blog in a subdirectory, a subfolder. But still, it's you know, it's kind of a technical thing. It's kind of a decision that a company has to make. A lot of companies decide to split things off into subdomains. And so it's important to understand the difference between your subdomain and your main domain, what really is a subdomain. And then there's the TLD part, right? We're most familiar with the .com and probably .net and .edu, .org, all those kinds. And you may also be aware that there are some now, I think, what are they called? Special or custom TLDs now? So like .music, .news, and so forth. There's a lot of special ones you can get. I think you can even in some cases get even your own company name, right? Like .web4 if you wanted to get that. Then, of course, there's country CCTLDs, country code top-level domains, and those are very common, like DE for Deutschland, Germany, or UK for United Kingdom, IT for Italy, .fr for France. You know, you get the idea. So that's how things break down as far as that's concerned. Continuing on, a very related topic, URLs and URIs. I mentioned that sometimes people talk about, they'll say the word domain when they mean URL, or they'll say URL when they mean domain. That's okay. You'll hear people mix those up from time to time. Sometimes I do the same thing. I'll say domain, I meant URL, but it's not the end of the world. But it is good to know what the difference is. So let's get into real quick here what the difference is between a URL and a URI. So as you can see, URL stands for Universal Resource Locator. It's a specific address on the internet. It includes all the protocol, HTTPS, ://, includes www if they use it, the subdomain. It includes the domain name, web4, and includes the top-level domain, .com. And then if there's a page, that's the home page. And if there's a page, it would be, you know, web4.com/ whatever the page is. And whatever comes after the .com is technically the URI. And we can see that here on the next screen. So this is technically a URL. It's not a domain. This is the domain QXC, but some people will refer to a URL as a domain. Again, that's okay. You don't have to call people out on that. You'll understand that they meant, URL when they said domain or vice versa. That's okay. Again, yeah, I sometimes do that too. No big deal. So this is all of this together, the protocol, the subdomain, main domain, top-level domain, and this page is all a URL. But everything after the .com or .org, .whatever, is technically a URI. So if you hear somebody use the term URI, you'll understand what that means. Good. Hey, we've covered a bit so far, so let's take a short break with web trivia time. Some of you will already know the answer to this, I bet. But what was Google called before it was Google? Was it the Oracle? Was it the everything page? I like the everything pages. I really like that. Was it Backrub? That's ridiculous. That can't be true. Robotic overlords are us. I like that one a lot. Or was that just all of the above? Did they inside Google, they just basically referred to it using all those? Or was it none of the above? Well, if we were all together today, you saw my wish you were here postcard in the beginning, right? If we were all together like we were originally intending to be, you could shout out your answers, but you can't do that here, sorry. So I'm just going to tell you what the answer is. You can shout inside your head or shout in your office there or your home office. Correct answer is actually Backrub, believe it or not. Larry Page, co-founder of Google, called it that because the search engine relied on backlinks to surface search results, which, by the way, if you were around before Google was around, you may remember finding anything on the internet was a real pain in the butt. In addition to taking that class on HTML, I actually took classes on how to search the internet and find what you're looking for. I learned all about special operators and what do they call them, Boolean queries, using logic like or and stuff like that to try to find things. It was really painful to try to find stuff on the internet. Yahoo was really popular back then, and some other search engines like Alta Vista and stuff, but it seems like finding anything was really just hard to find what you were looking for. A friend of mine referred Google to me before I ever heard of it. He was kind of a really geeky kind of guy, really into all kinds of, including the internet, and he was already making his own websites and everything, and he said, David, you ought to try this new search engine, Google. And I did, and lo and behold, I could find what I was looking for suddenly. And the reason why it was superior to other search engines is because Larry Page, co-founder of Google, he essentially used the citation model from education, from academia. The citation model is where, if you've ever read a scientific paper of some kind, at the very end, there's what's called citations. And it's all the other studies that this author of the current study you're reading is referencing in his own study. And one of the things that's kind of true in academia is the more people who are citing your study, then the more authoritative your study is. If nobody is citing your study, then your study might not be considered all that authoritative. So Larry applied the same logic to websites. Well, if we can measure the relative authority of different pages on the internet and how they're interlinking to each other, then we can track backwards through that and figure out, and they call that backlinking. We can track backwards and say, well, the sites that get the most links must be the best sites. Now, in reality, their formula was much more complicated than that. It's called PageRank. You can look it up on Wikipedia. I'm sure PageRank has evolved far past what you can see on Wikipedia today, or the paper you can read on it that Larry did at Stanford. Google was just a Stanford project, a college project, believe it or not. So it's a little bit more complicated than just, the most links win. There was ways of weighting links and deciding how much weight a link should get, how much authority that page had. So it's a little more complicated than just line up as many links as you can and you win. But nevertheless, that was why Google was so successful. A little detour to SEO land there. So continuing on, web technology. So we've talked about the internet. We've talked about some of the different aspects of the internet so far, URLs, domain names, web servers. Now let's talk about the fundamentals of how web pages are created. And primarily, for the most part, web pages are created, websites and web pages are created using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, primarily. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And HTML is actually a markup language. It's not a coding or programming language. And it's a relatively easy language to learn. And that has to be true because I learned it way back when. And if I can learn it, anybody can. Because I have studied some coding and programming, but I can't code or program my way out of a wet paper sack. But as I've been talking about, especially more towards the beginning, my understanding of programming languages, like if you understand how programming languages work, you know, loops, variables, all this different stuff that comprises programming languages, that can really help you to understand what the capabilities are and what the limitations are of those languages. And most programming languages have a lot of similarities to them. Like I said, you know, loops and conditionals and variables, you know, a lot of programming languages rely on those kinds of things. And if you know what those things are and you understand that, then that gives you a much better understanding of like what the capabilities and limitations are. And it helps you to, like I said, be able to speak people's language and understand what's happening. Now, HTML, again, is a markup language. It's what primarily comprised web pages in the beginning, before JavaScript and CSS. In fact, back in 1999, when I learned HTML, there wasn't any, at least as far as at the time, the teacher wasn't teaching certainly. It might have been on the fringes or something, but in the mainstream it wasn't. I think Kevin will nod his head and others on the line will nod your head in recognition of, remember when we used to have to position everything using tables, right? So there just wasn't CSS and JavaScript to help us with websites. So they were kind of, you know, kind of basic back in the day. So hypertext markup language is the primary language of the internet, really, and of web pages, I should say. And so not all HTML outputs to your actual page. And this is a good example, two examples of stuff that you can find in web page HTML that actually you won't find on the visual page itself. However, this stuff does output to Google into Google search results. So that's kind of important for, like, you know, your SEO work, right? Because your title tag, which you can see how HTML works, I've got the tags in red here. So you open the tag by declaring it, and then you close it with the / here. And so you're opening and closing your title tag. And same thing with your meta description tag. And you declare it, and then you close it. And then in between the quotes, you have what your description is. And these things show up in Google search results kind of like a little ad. You get, you know, your title tag is a clickable link in the search results, and then the little blurb of text underneath is typically your meta description. So it doesn't output really physically to your page, but it does output into Google search results. So it's important to know about that. So it's HTML. Also, HTML is the actual text that does output to your page will typically be between an opening body tag and the closing body tag. And text can typically be put between, you know, and this is really basic, between paragraph tags. There's other ways of styling your HTML that's more sophisticated than that. This is really very basic. But you can get out a notepad, you know, a text pad today and creating HTML files today just using what I've taught you so far almost. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to create a web page using HTML. In fact, when I first started learning it, again, you know, we were just doing it on text pads, you know, just a notepad, just hard coding, all hard writing, I guess it's not really coding, but you can call it that, right? So we were hard coding everything, just creating everything. Later, someone introduced me to Dreamweaver. And Dreamweaver is a software program that allows you to create websites with a little bit more structure in a more sophisticated way than just using a notepad, much more sophisticated manner. And then later I got introduced to WordPress, which is technically a content management system, which we'll talk about later, which really allowed me as a website creator not have to sit and code. WordPress and other CMSs, Drupal, Joomla, they do all the heavy lifting for you in terms of all the coding on the back end. But we'll get to that. So that's HTML, quick overview of HTML, and that's the main backbone of web pages and websites. So is CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and CSS allows you to separate content from presentation. So the HTML is content, CSS is about presentation. It allows you to define your text fonts, various colors, the position of things to a certain extent, the layout and styling. So CSS is more about how things are going to lay out. So you don't have to use tables anymore. And then finally, JavaScript. So JavaScript came along, and JavaScript is a scripting language, technically, not a programming language. We'll get to that. And the main reason why JavaScript was invented was to add interactivity to pages. So you could click on something and something would happen. Or you'd hover and something would drop, like you get a drop-down menu on hover, right? Or you'd click on something and then something would pop up or whatever. So, you know, JavaScript created interactivity where HTML didn't have that. And JavaScript, you should know, runs in the browser, not on the server. And we're going to talk more about browsers and servers, client and server, front end and back end. We'll talk about that more later too. And finally, for any SEOs in the group, it's not the devil. So I say that because JavaScript was never intended to deliver content. It was designed to deliver interactivity. However, the web and web technology lives and dies by developer adoption. And so if developers all decide today to stop using a particular language, like they all decide, you know, hey, we're not using just, you know, we're not going to use PHP anymore. Well, then that language is going to die because no one's using it. Or everybody decides, hey, you know what, we're really on board with Ruby or Ruby on Rails or whatever, and just everybody's on board with that. So there's a lot of programming languages out there, and their popularity and usage just depends on developer adoption. And one thing that developers have gotten into doing with respect to creating websites in the modern age is creating JavaScript-based websites. And we're going to talk about that more at the very end, or certainly towards the end. But just for now, we can understand that while HTML, CSS, and JavaScript were typically deployed in creating websites and web pages in the manner I previously described, people these days are also creating JavaScript-based websites as well. That's the modern thing. So we as SEOs, again, this is not the devil comment, means, you know, we SEOs, and you know, anybody who's an SEO on the call or otherwise, you just got to go with the flow. Yes, I don't think that developers should be developing in JavaScript right now because it's, you know, Google's handling of it is spotty and sketchy, and for all of the upfront ease and painlessness you have up front in development, that's why developers like it, because it's elegant, right? It's easier, it's smoother, it's faster. You can put all these components together and you can build things quickly. And if there are any developers on the call, you know how it is. Everybody wants what they want from you yesterday, right? So everything's always on a tight timeline. No one ever says, when does anybody ever say to you, any developers on the call, anybody ever said, hey, take your time, whenever is fine? No. Yes, we need this yesterday. So developers need to be able to work quick. And so, you know, having done, you know, my own basic development in web design myself, I understand the idea of looking for the most elegant solution. The least amount of code you can write to get something done makes sense. And that's called elegance. So, you know, we SEOs, we just kind of got to go with the flow. If people are doing it with JavaScript, that's that. But what I was going to say is that what I was starting to say is that oftentimes the time saved in the beginning and the ease of development for JavaScript websites is more than made up and lost when it comes to having to do all the workarounds you need to do to get Google to be able to understand your pages and see them and see the content. You know, it gets into all kinds of issues like server-side rendering and pre-rendering and dynamic rendering and all kinds of stuff that, you know, you have to you put all these workarounds in place that take as much time, if not more time, than if you just did a website, you know, without using JavaScript in the first place. So I think that in the future that will change. I think that things will improve in the future. I think that JavaScript will end up being almost like a content management system at some point, and Google will be far better at processing JavaScript. So I think all that will change in the future just because we're going to have to change. Anyway, that's enough about beating that drum. Let's move on. So here's an example of a JavaScript file, by the way. So if you do nothing else in this presentation, please memorize that. Got it memorized? Good, we can move on. Here's some acronyms for you. Let's talk about JSON-LD, XML, and AJAX. So we talked about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but these are technologies that you'll also run into and should at least have a passing familiarity with. Hey, you remember what I said at the beginning? If you run across anything either so far or now or in the future in my presentation here that you'd like to know more about, make a note of it and be sure to research it more later. And also keep in mind, I just want to repeat this in case anybody's starting to feel like, oh man, I'm already feeling like my cup is full. We got more to talk about. Yeah, but don't worry about it. You don't have to keep all this in your head. You don't have to memorize everything. And you don't have to do all this or even, look over the shoulder of somebody doing it to understand it. You can get a basic understanding, and that way when people are talking about any of this stuff, you'll know what it is, and you won't feel intimidated. You'll feel empowered. And again, remember, you can always Google something if you're like, JSON-LD, I thought I knew what that was. What is that? Just Google it. So let's talk about it. JSON-LD is JavaScript object notation for linked data. A big mouthful of terms for something that's not that hard to understand. It's based on JavaScript, and what it does is really helpful to search engines like Google and Bing and others. It basically takes data, right, that's sitting in the code of web pages that may be unstructured. It takes all of that data that's sprinkled throughout your HTML, and using JSON-LD, you can create structure out of that. So you see all this data, all these colors all randomly configured, and now we've got everything all neatly organized. And so that makes it easier for machines to understand because for now, robots need our help. Later, we'll see. So here's an example of some JSON-LD. Now, if you stop the breathing, keep breathing. Don't let code scare you. Code is your friend. If you're not a coder programmer type, that's okay. Again, you don't need to know coder programming. And the note down here, note the key value pairs in the structure. So let's just kind of take a quick look at the structure. It starts out with a script tag opening, not dissimilar to HTML. However, JavaScript is not the same as HTML. It is a scripting language. It's not a markup language. And we'll talk more about what that means later. So you start with your opening tag, and you're declaring that it's JSON-LD. And then you've got some opening and closing brackets, and of course you've got your closing script tag here. But in between, you've got key value pairs. Here's the keys: context, type, author, content rating, image, and name. And then you've got the values. And so you can see the different values here. The context is schema.org, because what we're doing is we're using schema.org to put in our structured data here, structured markup. So if the type is creative work, we'll see what the author is. The content rating is, oh, this is mature. We've got an image that we're using. So here's the name of the image, the value of the image, and what the name of the specific thing is that we're talking about here. So this is a lot easier for machines to crawl and understand. Google can see the opening script tag here and say, aha, some JSON-LD. Let me eat that up and see what it is. And it can understand all of these key value pairs much more easily than if this information is simply scattered about on the HTML somewhere, in the page somewhere. The name of the game is there, the rating is there, the company or author is there. All that stuff is there somewhere, but Google has to try to grab it all and put it all together and understand it. This makes it a lot easier, puts it all in one simple place where it's easy to grab and understand. Cool, let's move on to XML. That stands for Extensible Markup Language. And essentially, XML is used for a number of different things, and it's very similar to HTML, but probably the most common thing that you see XML used for is XML sitemaps. And that's where you'll take a list of all your pages on your site, and you'll put them in a specific format in your XML file, and then you put that on your server. All of it's starting to come together, right? You put that on your server, and then when Google shows up, you can put the location of your XML sitemap in your robots text file. And then Google can see that and then go to it, and then it'll crawl all those URLs. And XML sitemaps can do a number of things for you, like signify all the important pages that you want to be sure that Google can crawl. And there's some other neat things you can do with XML sitemaps too. So as I mentioned, Google will show up, and it will find all those XML sitemap files, of which you can have multiple, because there are certain limitations to sitemap files, like how big the file size can be, how many URLs you can display in it. So there's limitations, so you might need more than one. But it's essentially a list of URLs for Google or Bing to crawl and see. Another really common example is of an XML sitemap is an hreflang XML sitemap. And so hreflang is something that Google put out that people can use, developers can use, SEOs can use, to help Google to understand the language of the page and country too, but primarily language. And so, you know, you can put that code, that hreflang code that Google came up with, you can put that right in the HTML of each page of your site. But putting it in each page and then getting all the return tags on every page, that's a lot of work to do that. So sometimes it's easier to just use a single file. Just use an XML file and put all your hreflang tags right there in one file, and Google can crawl that and see that, and boom, done. So those are kind of the two most common XML usages you're going to see. Is going to be, but we're going to see another use of XML in a minute. But those are kind of the most common two types you'll run into more than likely, is a regular XML sitemap and an hreflang XML sitemap. All right, so I did say we were going to have another use for XML, and here it is. It's using AJAX, and that's asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So we've heard about JavaScript, we've heard about XML, we haven't heard about asynchronous yet, so let's put this all together. So asynchronous simply means that things are happening at the same time. So it means that on the server side, things are happening, and on the browser side, the client side, things are happening, but they're happening at the same time. One is not waiting for the other, right? Because if one has to wait for the other, then there's a lag. If there's a lag, it makes things slower. If there's no lag and things are happening at the same time, which is asynchronous, then things are happening faster, and faster is better on the internet. Pages load faster and stuff happens faster. So that's what asynchronous means. Now JavaScript we've talked about, right? That usually adds interactivity to pages. So JavaScript is used client-side, right, because it's a client-side language, and it's used to make the server request. And so the server responds, and basically data is sent, again, asynchronously, from the server to the client. It's packaged in an XML format. And so that can be easily processed by the JavaScript, and again, it's all about just making things faster. So XML is, so AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, is something that you might run into or have run into. So if you've ever wondered what that was, or if you ever hear it in the future, now you won't be, like, well, what does AJAX have? You don't have to nod and smile and have no idea what people are talking about. When they say, well, here's how we're going to solve this problem. We're going to implement some AJAX that will call the server and pull back the blah, 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 and you'll know exactly what they mean. Again, you don't have to do it. You don't have to wire a house to turn on the lights, right? But understanding that these technologies are out there will be definitely beneficial to you. So that's AJAX. That brings us to, you've heard me throughout sprinkle in terms like front end and back end, client side and server side, and I've been doing that kind of on purpose to kind of pre-teach this, if you will. You'll hear these terms bandied about: front end, back end, client side, server side. What the heck do they mean? Essentially, client side or front end, you might hear someone say, well, I'm a front end developer. So, oh, what is it? Front end to what? Front end of a car? I mean, you do the front side of a car? I don't understand what that means. So front end, client side, that just means browser side. Back end or server side means stuff that happens on the server. When you hear somebody refer to themselves as a full stack developer, it means that they are comfortable and familiar with using programming languages and scripting languages that run on the front end and stuff that runs on the back end, code that runs on the back end. So an example, right, front end stuff that might run is JavaScript. I mentioned that a few times. JavaScript tends to run in the browser. Back end is something like PHP. PHP runs on the server. And so when you hear people talk about these things, well, this is happening client side, or I'm a front end developer, whatever, that kind of thing. Now you know what those things mean. And so, yes, front end and client side do mean the same thing essentially, and server side and back end also mean the same thing. Cool? Cool. Which does bring us to the idea of programming and scripting languages. What's the difference? What's that about? Is it helpful to know? It really is helpful to know. So programming languages generally, and this is one of those areas where if you start to research this further, and feel free to, you'll find that there are differences of opinion out there amongst experts in the computer language world, the computer science world. But generally speaking, there's generally a consensus that the difference between a programming language and a scripting language is that a programming language definitely requires a compiling step, an explicit compiling step. So all the code that the programmer writes, that they can read, then is compiled, and it's run through a process that turns it into a set of instructions that then the computer can understand. So there's that require that intermediary compiling step, and they're quote unquote interpreted like on the fly. So that's the difference between a programming language and a scripting language. So some common scripting, or maybe not so common, maybe Perl not so common anymore, but some relatively common scripting languages, definitely JavaScript for sure. We got VB script, PHP is definitely very common. Perl, Python is in frequent use. Python's a very popular language. Then you have, programming languages like Java, C, C++, Pascal, Visual Basic. So those are some examples of scripting versus programming languages. And again, you don't have to be you don't have to be a coder programmer to at least understand how, programming languages work. I do recommend looking into understanding how programming languages work. Like I said, the basic concepts of variables, loops, conditionals, which are if-then statements and that kind of thing. It's just good to understand how that stuff works. It really can help you when you're having discussions with developers or just listening in on discussions where people are talking about solutions they're going to implement or changes they're going to make. Really helps you to understand what the guts are that are involved with all that. Cool. Continuing on, let's talk about content management systems. So this is kind of a logical progression from before the internet to where we are today, hopefully, this presentation is. And so now we're talking about content management systems. So back in the day when, the very beginnings of the internet, there really weren't content management systems, at least not that I'm aware of. And you had to pretty much hard code everything you wanted to do. So if you wanted to have a website, you had to code it. There were no content management systems. But then over time, content management systems came along, and those are typically abbreviated as CMS. What they allow you to do is they make it a lot easier for somebody to create their own website because they don't have to do all the programming work, all the coding work. You don't have to learn HTML. You don't have to learn JavaScript. You don't have to learn CSS. I know that there's people on this call, I know, for instance, one name we mentioned at the top of this call, Jason Wright, COO of Web4. You can just give him a notepad, and he can just from scratch completely create a website, maybe with some other tools too. But he's conversant with HTML, CSS, JavaScript. He can write it all, get it all done, put up a website, and have it done from scratch. But that's a lot of work. What if you don't know how to do that, or you don't want to do that? Well, you can use a content management system. There's some popular ones out there you've heard of that you can use, like you've heard of Wix or other ones like that. And here's some symbols of some, how many can you guess here, right? So I think we got WordPress, Magento, there's Drupal, I think that's Shopify, that might be something, no, I can't even remember what all these are. But here they are by market share. Some of probably the most popular one overall really is WordPress. You might have heard of WordPress. It's a very popular content management system. And again, what's a CMS? It allows you to create your website without having to do the custom coding and programming you would need to do to get your website technically up and running. So you don't have to be a technical person to get your website going, per se. So there's a bunch of different ones out there. It's really a feat just to know how each CMS works, much less how every programming language works, right? So there's a lot to know out there, so you can't know everything, so it doesn't make sense to know everything. I personally was turned on to WordPress some years after I was using Dreamweaver, as I mentioned earlier. And I just fell in love with WordPress, and I just ran with it. If the person who introduced me to WordPress had introduced me to Joomla, maybe that's what I'd be in love with today. But it was WordPress, and I found it so much easier to then get websites up and running. And you know what? The reality is when I made websites, they looked terrible. I was an awful website designer. They were really ugly. And so WordPress allowed me to, they have themes. And the themes are the skin of your website. And you can change themes just with a click of a button. So you can make really professional looking websites with WordPress without, really being a designer, which is really great. So that's one of the reasons I really like WordPress, and it saved me a lot of the hassle of all the coding that I had to do in Dreamweaver. So WordPresses are very popular and used by a lot of people. You'll definitely run into CMSs in your role as a digital marketer. And so it's helpful to understand how a CMS works, because I mentioned like Jason could code a website from scratch. Then what does he do with all his files? That's right, he opens his FTP client, file transfer protocol, uploads them to his hosting service, right? And then all those files are now on the internet. So he's got his website on the internet. But a CMS works slightly differently. Typically what will happen is like, for instance, I have a hosting service I use. And at the hosting service, they have the ability for me to install WordPress where I designate. So I can do a WordPress install somewhere on my website, somewhere in my hosting panel. And it does all the heavy lifting for me. And then everything's ready to go. And I'm ready to now just pick my theme, start adding pages and blog posts. So it really accelerates and makes things a lot faster. But how do things work then? So where Jason, when he custom coded his website, had to FTP all that up there and do everything, how does the CMS work then? What it essentially does is it has templates for different sections of your site. What it does is it dynamically populates all of those by calling from databases. So it'll pull on, so for each page, like when you click on a new page in WordPress, right, you visit one home page, and you go to the About page, and you go to the Shop page or whatever page you're going to. What it does when you click and go to the next page is it loads the template and calls to the server all the text and images and everything that goes along with the that page, header, footer, navigation, the whole 9 yards. By the way, I should mention this. I'm sure the presentation will be passed around later. And there's a link in here to a blog post I wrote on the SEM PDX blog. It's the essential guide to understanding content management systems. So I definitely recommend reading that. And by the way, speaking of SEM PDX, it's a great organization. They're based in Portland. I don't know how many of you online are members of SEM PDX, but I'm a member of SEM PDX. I had the distinct pleasure of serving on the board for a couple years. And in fact, Kevin Getch, owner of Web4, was the president of SEM PDX for a while there too. And so I highly recommend, if you want to be around a group of like-minded individuals who are in your industry, so you can do some networking and attend educational events. They have monthly workshops. Well, they were live, and now they're going to be virtual for a while. Looks like everything's virtual for a while. It's a wonderful organization. So I highly recommend SEM PDX. Come to a workshop, see what you think, and become a member. I think you won't regret it. I sure don't. Really, really think it's a great group, great people, and wonderful opportunities for education and networking. Can't say enough about SEM PDX, but I'll stop there. So anyway, so that's how a CMS works, right? Templates, grab data from databases. They're created on each page is actually created on the fly. Whereas Jason created each page of his website by hand, one by one, and then uploaded each of those pages one by one, or in a group, by FTP up to his web hosting service, to the server. So CMSs actually work on the fly, dynamically generating pages from templates. Kind of interesting, right? I think so. You do too. Oh, hey, we've covered a lot of stuff. It's web trivia time again. This time we're sticking with our Google theme. And the question is, where did the name Google come from? Was it? It came from Google co-founder Larry Page in a dream. I like that answer. I like that answer a lot. It was an inside joke about Larry Page, co-founder of Google, using too much hair gel. They used to, rib him about it, using too much goo in his hair. Or was it because the domain Google was already taken? Or was it Larry's dog's name? Or was it Larry's dad came up with it? Or was it none of the above? Again, I wish we were all together so you could shout out your answers and I could throw a bag of M&Ms to whoever comes up with the right name. So I'll toss a virtual bag of M&Ms at y'all. How about that? The actual answer is Google was already taken. Google is some like really big number, and so those, you know, computer science geeks, you know, they're all about that kind of inside joke. It's kind of funny, right? It's kind of cute and funny. So that's your web trivia for this section. All right, moving on. Back to work. Let's talk about more acronyms. Let's talk about CDN. So a CDN is a content delivery network, sometimes called a content distribution network. What are they? How do they work? Why do you need to know about it? Why is it helpful to know? Well, basically what it does is there are servers located around the globe that are proxy servers and data centers that deliver your files to people in that area. So like my hosting service is based like here in the United States, in one of the states. So anybody who wants to access my website is accessing from the United States. If they're halfway around the planet, you know, that halfway around the planet, even at light speed, takes time for the connection and everything. So by using a CDN, you're closer to that person halfway around the globe in a server closer to them, and so things can load a little faster. So content delivery network can, in theory, make things a little faster. They don't always, but that's the basic concept, and they offer other benefits as well. So here's the visual idea, right? All around the world, you have all these servers that your hosting service has or the CDN provider has. You know, Cloudflare is a very commonly known and commonly used CDN service. So Cloudflare, for example, has their servers all located all over the place. So again, if I'm here in the United States, but someone's way over here in Europe, and they're accessing my website, then they'll be accessing a server through the CDN that's closer to them, therefore speeding things up. Good to know about. Let's talk about, so we're still talking about web technology, obviously, right? Kind of started with the broad overview and kind of narrowing down to how sites are created, where they're hosted and everything, understanding various bits of web technology, and we're continuing with that. So HTTPS, SSL, and TLS, the basics of that is secure versus unsecure, or I think technically the term is insecure. So an HTTP page is insecure, which means that, you know, it's kind of shy, and when it gets in groups, it kind of just hangs on the edges of the room, and, you know, it doesn't go out to meet people. Just kidding. I think the terms are kind of used interchangeably, but most often you'll hear insecure. But generally speaking, insecure is not the way to go these days. You know, it kind of didn't matter before. If you were an e-commerce site, you kind of had to be secure because you had to secure your connection between your website and the user. Because if you didn't have a secure connection, someone might be able to like sniff the connection and steal your credit card number, and that's not good, right? Or you have an insecure connection and someone can, you know, see what you're doing or read your email and invade your privacy, steal your privacy, that kind of stuff. Not good. Steal your identity, not very good. So SSL and TLS are terms that refer to a handshake. It's a term you'll hear often, a handshake that happens between the client and the server. And you know what client and server is now, right? Happens between the front end and the back end. You know about that now. So it's good to know that the handshake doesn't do any encryption. It's just kind of the connection itself. And it agrees on the shared secret and the type of encryption that's going to be used. So SSL stands for Secure Socket Layer. It was the predecessor to TLS. TLS is the modern version of SSL. It stands for Transport Layer Security. Again, they're both cryptographic protocols. You know, cryptography, what? That's the study of, like, you know, codes. Remember, like you probably are seen on the History Channel and programs about World War II, about code breakers, right? People trying to break the Nazi code or whatever, right? They were cryptography experts who learned how to, you know, try to create messages that no one could read or try to break the other people's messages that they couldn't read. So that's the whole idea, is security there. And it's a way of making a connection that keeps the connection secure so that you can't have some intermediary, some other person, some third party come in and, like I said, try to steal your credit card data or otherwise intercept what you're doing. And you basically go about this by getting a certificate with your host, and but really it's good to know that, you know, the certificate really isn't the protocol. Protocols are determined by server configuration. So in order to have HTTPS happen, like my host just did it all automatically for me. It was part of what the fee that I'm paying. I didn't have to go out and get a new certificate. I didn't have to reconfigure any servers. The hosting service did it all for me. Excuse me. It's one of the advantages of having a good host is oftentimes you can get a lot of this stuff done without having, like I mentioned, WordPress, right? Don't have to really do a lot of heavy lifting with WordPress. I push a button, I've got my install done, and I'm ready to start making my web pages. So just makes things faster and easier. So there's ways of shortcutting things. Good to know the behind the scenes of some of this stuff. And there is the Security Standards Council, and they're good to know about. Simply, there is a body that control what the standards are for security, because as you might imagine, things can go off in all kinds of tangents in different directions. And so far, speaking of going in different directions, you might have an idea right now that there's a lot of technologies that comprise the web. There's a lot of different ways you can make websites. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but I mentioned you can code them from scratch. You can use a content management system. There are other ways of making websites we'll talk about too. And so things get splintered and fractured. You might think that a website's a website, right? Nope. They're all built differently. I suppose it's similar to different automakers. You say, well, I know how to fix a BMW. Does that mean you know how to fix a Ford? Not necessarily, right? So someone who's used to working like in one language might not know how to work in another language. They might be able to learn it more quickly, but they might not know that language. So it's good to know that it's good to understand, that there isn't consistency with respect to how websites are created or the technologies used. And it's the same thing on the security side. People create all kinds of security protocols, but this group is trying to have, order, right? Try to bring order to things. And so like when SSL was deprecated and TLS was introduced, they kind of set a deadline. Here's the deadline for when you need to bring yourselves up to TLS standards. Another thing that we can talk about, and we're on the homeward stretch here in case you're wondering how much more your brain has to absorb. We're on the downward stretch here. So application programming interface, you might hear people talk about APIs. And again, rather than nod and smile or scratch your head and wonder, you'll know what this is about. An API is basically a mechanism of getting information, typically from someone's database. Of exchange, some mechanism to exchange data. And it looks something like this in a simplified manner. On your end, you're using something typically like some interface of some sort to request via the API, a pipeline essentially, their information. And so you might have, let's say, a Google Sheets that's pulling down Google Search Console data, for example. So that's one small example of how that would work. And so APIs basically let you get data. Not much more to say about that, but in case you run across that, you'll understand what it is. And you can, like I said, look into more depth about APIs. But typically, it typically requires some technical capability. There are tools that will allow you to access APIs without being a coder programmer, but oftentimes it requires something like Python or another programming language to be able to access APIs. Typically, it's what developers will do on that technical side. All right, so the last topic that I hinted at a moment ago, and more acronyms, right? AMP, PWA, and SPA, are some of the most recent inventions when it comes to how to make websites. So we started all the way back at the internet itself, what it is, World Wide Web, how websites are constructed, a whole bunch of different aspects about websites and web technology. And now we're finishing up, we're kind of just putting the icing on the cake here with the idea of some modern ways that people are making websites. I probably have a little more information in this section than I really need to, but what the heck, it'll be fun. So AMP, let's start with that. Google came out a few years back with something called AMP. It stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages. The whole idea is let's make the web fast. And they're including myself, have opinions about accelerated mobile pages and the idea of us needing to even have another way of making websites. Because you can make a website using AMP. And, excuse me. So I asked a developer who I highly respect not that long ago, what's your opinion about accelerated mobile pages? And I thought his answer was really cogent. He said, in my opinion, it's just more splintering and fracturing of the marketplace and just makes things more confusing about what people need to do or should do. And he went on to say that, because Google put it out, Google's kind of the 800-pound gorilla, right? If you want to get anybody's attention, just, you're talking to your clients or whatever, just start with Google says, and then, that's the word of God, right? If Google said it, then it must be true. So a lot of times people think, well, we have to use AMP because it's a Google thing. Well, no, you don't have to use AMP. And, in the reality, accelerated mobile pages, AMP, are just HTML, It's a lot of people who I've talked to other developers who have said, why did Google need to reinvent HTML? I don't get that. And I know some pretty sharp developers who said, I can create pages that are just as fast or faster than AMP pages without using AMP. I didn't need AMP in the first place. So some things like this are a little controversial. I think that's kind of what I'm just kind of getting at there, that AMP could be controversial depending on who you talk to. But essentially what it is a way of making web pages load very fast. I mean, in the very beginning, it was introduced only, Google introduced it only for news organizations to use, and later they opened it up for everybody to use. And in terms of like, well, if you're saying, well, I'm going to do a website, what should I do? Should I, get someone like, a designer developer type who can, code web pages from scratch and FTP, all my files up to my host? Or should I use a content management system like WordPress or Joomla or Drupal or Shopify, or should I use AMP, right? Because Google has this AMP thing. Should I use AMP? And really, that really depends. The answer really depends. And so if you were considering redoing your website from using AMP or doing a brand new website using AMP, you need to think about a few things here. You need to think about the resources it's going to take to code those. Does your developer, already know how to do AMP and what the resources are going to be involved there? The analytics challenges involved. There's strict limits to what you can do with AMP. They're constantly expanding it. They're trying to make it so that it does everything. But it's had a lot of limitations to it, which again, they're trying to break those down, but still. And then again, with AMP, the future is uncertain. Remember I said that developer adoption drives things, right? If developers adopt the language or whatever, or developers go crazy for AMP, and AMP is super popular, then it's popular because developers made it popular. It's up to developers what happens. So the future is a little uncertain there. A lot of people swear by AMP, some hate it, some love it. There you go. So there's some components to it. Again, maybe more detail than we really need to get into, but there's the AMP HTML, which has all its restrictions. There's the AMP JavaScript library. You can only use that. You can only use their library. Can't just put any JavaScript you want, so your hands are tied. And then there's this thing called the AMP cache, which I'm not going to get a lot into, but basically it's the reason why AMP pages are fast is because they're being served from the AMP cache. So there's that. Here's a whole bunch of AMP facts. Only asynchronous JavaScript. Hey, you know what that means? Wow, cool. And there's a whole bunch of different things that are like some limitations. I put this on here simply to note that there really are a lot of limitations to what you can do with AMP. And so, got to think about that when if you decide to develop with AMP. Then there's another thing called progressive web apps, which holds a lot of promise. They seem to be gaining a lot of developer adoption. Again, it depends on who you talk to. Some people really like them, some people don't like them at all, but progressive web apps are another way of creating a website. Let's talk about them a little bit. It basically is taking advantage of a lot of the latest technology on the web. Web tech, that's what we're talking about. So progressive web apps have all of these facts and features to them. One of them that's really interesting, the reason progressive is in the name, is because it's backwards compatible for every browser. So you could be on the oldest browser ever created, in theory, and it'll still work. If you're a coder, programmer, website developer on the phone, remember where in the past where you had to do all the exceptions for Internet Explorer and all that kind of stuff. Well, the whole idea of a progressive web app is that it's just going to work no matter what. It's automatically responsive, so it adjusts right away to whatever the size of the screen is. It loads right away. It's very fast. It has the look and feel of an app. It's always up to date. It's served through secure. In fact, you have to have secure connection in order to use it. It can be more engaging. You can do stuff like push notifications. In other words, it's a website that can act like an app. People can even install it on their home screen, right? So it's very much like an app, and it's easily shared via URL as well. So there's some different aspects to it. Again, probably more detail than we need here, but you need your app shell, your service worker, and your app manifest. These things all are specific things that are important to having a progressive web app up and running. And again, if you're going to build that way, you want a developer who knows what they're doing with progressive web apps, has experience with that. So, you have your app shell, it's some code, and the shell, inside the shell comes the content, and the shell, loads instantly on repeat visits. Typically with a progressive web app, it's going to be the first page view is going to be the slowest, and then after that, everything's going to happen really fast. There's a thing called a service worker in between that's basically helping to communicate and serve things up, basically, essentially. So the service workers, as I mentioned, they handle that performance between the server and the client, in this case the phone, the browser in the phone. So you have the service worker doing all the heavy lifting, and there's cache to make things faster. So progressive web apps are yet another way that people can build websites in the modern time. And let's see, we can just skip past this stuff, but the general idea here is that progressive web apps have a lot of features that a native app doesn't, because like with a native app, for example, you have to download that. Progressive web app, you don't. Apps, got to be in the marketplace. You don't with a progressive web app, and so forth. Easier to index by Google. Finally, let's talk about SPA, single page application. And this is gaining a lot of adoption by developers, as I've mentioned. For example, Angular is one example of a single page application. There are websites that are built primarily using a JavaScript framework or JavaScript library. And they're gaining a lot of traction with developers because you can put all these components together and you can elegantly and quickly create websites. As I mentioned earlier, there's some downsides to them from an SEO perspective, and you may spend just as much time, if not more time, fixing those SEO problems than developing your website. So if you are going to develop in an SPA, you want to think about that ahead of time, what you're getting yourself into. And so there's a lot of different kinds out there. You've got React, Angular, Ember, there's a lot of different kinds. And essentially, it kind of splinters out and can be a little bit like, well, wait, what's what here? Because Angular is technically a JavaScript framework. React is technically a JavaScript library. Your library contains the framework. You call the framework with you call the library with your code, and it's a little bit kind of interesting how it all works together. And developers understand all of this stuff, even of course better than I do. As I mentioned at the front, I'm not a coder, programmer, or developer, but just a poor, lonely SEO. But the fact of the matter is that there are differences, and you may not need to know all this, but it is good to know at least the basics. And so the biggest things the biggest advantages to using an SPA that I've either have touched on explicitly or hinted at earlier is that it's very fast. Not only fast for the developer to make the website, but pages load fast. So it's good for user experience. It increases user experience. And as I mentioned, in the development time of creating the website, SEO may have not been at the forefront of what people were thinking about. So once it's all up and running and they say, hey, let's get that SEO thing going, it may have been an afterthought. And so there may be a lot of dev resources necessary to handle the single page application shortcomings that you run into. So similar to how I described a content management system which create pages dynamically on the fly, it's kind of similar with a single page application. Each page is dynamically rewritten, not loaded from the server. Remember, it's JavaScript, so everything is happening in the client. Everything's happening on the front end. See, there's all those terms you learned and you know what they mean now. Everything's happening in the client, the front end, in the browser. So going from page to page is a very quick experience for the user. So they call them single page applications because it's really kind of one shell where the content's just changing inside it. And so it's with dynamic communication with the server behind the scenes that's making all that happen. So it happens very fast. Again, this is all very popular and there's a lot of developer adoption for single page applications these days. And to repeat what I've said over and over, developer adoption or lack thereof is definitely make or break when it comes to web technology. So we've taken a pretty intensive jaunt around web technology, and before we take a break for the day and enter the Q&A section and everything, get to the summary and whatnot, one more trivia section is this, and it's this question. Which of these pre-Google search engines never existed? Was it, let's see if Kevin can get it, web crawler, He'll get it. Was it Lycos? He'll get this, I know. Was it Lycos? I'll try and fool him, but he can't let me fool him. Was it Alta Vista? Was it It can't be Excite. Who would name it Excite? Yahoo, that's a dumb name. Who would ever name that? Dogpile, that's ridiculous. Find It, that sounds logical. Or Ask Jeeves, which never existed. Which of these pre-Google search engines? What do you think, Kevin?
I know all of them except Find It, so I'm guessing it's Find It.
You're right.
Yeah.
And if anybody out there said, well, Yahoo, because it's a directory, technically you'd be right. So hopefully somebody shouted that out. So Kevin, I'm going to end, everybody, I'm going to end here, and I'm just going to do the summary, which is, hey, I think it's mandatory to know something about web tech. No, you don't have to know everything, but you can always Google it. You'll be better at your job. You'll get more done. You'll speak people's language. You'll gain more rapport and affinity, and you'll get projects moving forward as a result. So with that, you can also read my article about the same topic, the SEO's Essential Guide to Web Technology, linked here. And with that, I will say thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And it's unfortunate with all the Zoom bombing out there that we can't have everybody live on there, because you had some good zingers. I was laughing and some great stuff. So we'll see about trying to make this better and more interactive. But that was awesome. A lot of great information. There's a lot of cues coming in, and I'm going to see if what A's you have for that for the Q&A section.
I got to go.
Start with one from. Oh, bye. All right.
Kidding, yeah.
Well, if you do, that's fine too. I can address them. But
just kidding.
The one question from Matt. Matt asked if you could briefly describe the difference again between scripting and programming languages, and kind of what markup languages do they fit in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, thanks for your question, Matt. I'll answer that to the best I can. Some of these questions, if we have any development, Kevin, you can help me too if necessary. So basically, the difference between scripting and programming is the compiling step. A programming language, the programmer writes the code, and then it has to be compiled before the machine can really understand it. Whereas scripting languages like JavaScript or Python, you just write the code, and then it's all processed either client-side or server-side, and it's understood right away without any compiling step in between. Now, how they fit into, what was the last part of the question, how they fit, Kevin?
What are markup languages and where do they fit in?
Yeah, okay, so like for example, HTML is a markup language, and in your HTML you can insert some either PHP or some JavaScript. The JavaScript will run in the browser side, the front end, whereas the PHP will run on the back end. And so scripting languages can fit into your HTML like that, if I understood your question.
Perfect. And Abigail had a question. She was asking if you could elaborate on your log file research review process, and how often do you review log files?
Whenever I can get them, Abigail. Thanks for your question. Yeah, they're tough to get, as I mentioned. I would say really if you can get your hands on log files, because what I didn't mention earlier is they tend to be very large files, which makes them cumbersome and unwieldy. But what I tend to use is the Screaming Frog log file analyzer tool, which really makes life a lot easier. You can just drag those large files right into the tool itself, and it does a lot of the heavy lifting. Back in the old days, when I was working for Ian Lurie and stuff at Portney, man, we were using some really difficult, like, what do you call them, curl, requests and commands, I should say, and we were in the DOS shell and whatever else, doing all kinds of weird stuff to manipulate these files. But those days are gone with the advent. There's other tools out there you can use for log file processing, but the Screaming Frog tool is affordable. It works really well, and so I recommend that. In terms of frequency, if you do have access to log files, to me it makes sense to look at things quarterly, right? Because then you're looking for any broken pages, you're looking for any broken refers, you're looking to understand how the site's being crawled on a regular basis. I would say a quarter. If you can get them, I would say quarterly.
Nice. And I had a question more on your thoughts on, I guess, some of the future of web tech, and I feel like we're seeing, you know, app in the web kind of starting to find a middle ground, and progressive web apps seems like maybe one of those first steps. But I wanted to get your thoughts as far as what you saw as the future of some of this web technology and where it might go.
Yeah, you know, that comes up. That kind of question comes up a lot in digital marketing, where what are the current trends and how do they seem to project into the future? You know, like SEOs will get asked to try to, you know, well, if we make these changes, what's the predicted impact that we're going to get? It's kind of, you know, my crystal ball is always a little cloudy, and it's the same with web tech. But if I were to try to project out current trends, I would say that I hate to make predictions for that reason, but my prediction would be that SPAs are going to just continue to grow in popularity, and that they're going to evolve over time. Either the existing SPAs or new ones are going to be very sophisticated, and they'll work from the beginning. You won't have to have all these SEO workarounds anymore. You won't have to do pre-rendering, dynamic rendering, or any kind of rendering. It'll be done, kind of like WordPress, out of the box, ready to go, and working. And I think that that Google, and I'm getting this a little bit from, you know, probably like you, Kevin, I watch all the Google Webmaster Hangouts with John Mueller and try to, you know, and soak up everything Martin Splitt says in his videos, and even if it's over my head, because I'm trying to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on and where things are going, like you just asked about. And I keep hearing the message from Martin and from John Mueller that, you know, they're saying this is not going away, SEOs. You know, you need to learn to deal with the JavaScript world, and this is how more and more developers are adopting. So yeah, so to end where I started, I think that there will be platforms either developed or reconfigured, existing ones, to make it out of the box work. And I think Google's handling additionally will become more sophisticated, where they won't have to maybe do that two-step processing thing they do now, where they just handle everything in one step. So that's my prediction.
Awesome. Well, and there was a couple questions around whether this will be shared afterwards. We are recording, and we'll be uploading this and sharing it in the meetup group as well as online. And I just want to finish up by thanking you, David, so much for your time. That was amazing, and such a great recap of all the different things. It was sitting there for a second, like, okay, gosh, like I'm like wondering, and I was trying to write down some of the new things that a lot of the acronyms I just forgot. I'm like, okay, that's what that means. I'm like, did I know Ajax meant that? And so there's a lot of little things that I was just like, okay, like I'm getting all these things back in place. But it's crazy how much we stuff in our brain and how much we know over time. And that was a phenomenal recap that I think is so valuable to anyone in digital marketing to know all those things. Because like you said, it allows you to better speak the language of the team that you're working with. So
yeah,
I wanted to
thanks,
say thank
Kevin.
you again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Much thanks to you for that and for having me here to present this. It's really been a pleasure.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to sign off. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate your time, and we'll see you at the next DMQ. All right.
Thanks all. Bye.